Good morning, it's just Jen, the Liberty Lion, and today I want to go over slavocracy and trustocracy. I posted this on my community chat on YouTube, so if you want to read along or just read it on your own, you're more than welcome to, of course. And I'm going to go over some of the stuff in here, as well as once we get to the trustocracy, I want to look at the laws, the titles, and explain to you how a trustocracy is a form of socialism and how socialism is expressed in some of the titles that we think are laws and that we have to follow, but actually require us to sign an agreement. So we believe that we live in a republic and all the federal laws are all the titles and that we have to follow them. And this is just not the case. I go through a lot of this stuff in the book that I wrote, the Perceptions of Freedom book, how the Constitution is a military stratocracy, and what all this means and how it came about. So I want to start by first defining a few things. The ocracy is used in here as a form of social society, that this is a theory of a social organization. So it's a political situation where socialism is the background. Socialism is the institution. And then we have shadows, which is anything tangible and movable. Once we get into trustocracies, we're talking about something held legally for something else, or some people held legally for some other people. This is a legal situation. Now we know by now that legal situations are fictions. They're man-made, and they require bonds and bondsmen. Okay, so trusts hold things. Okay, they hold things for beneficiaries. So if you think about federal lands are held in a trust by the federal government, but what about off federal lands? These banks and all these other social institutions are holding things for people that they don't actually own them, but they're held as legal property. Okay, so let's go over slavocracy and trustocracy. This is an article written in the Daily People. In 1910, it cost 1 cent. I thought that was cool. And it's volume 11, number 15, New York, Friday, July 15th, 1910. And again, Daily People. This is from a social paper, a social party. So the reason why I want to read this to you is because it enlightens us as to the situation that we're in now, that most people don't understand, and that we're caught up in these trusts, and these trusts are run through the non-positive laws. So if you follow my videos, I talk a lot about the positive laws and the non-positive laws, and these non-positive laws are part of how trusts are run. And these trusts, of course, like I said, are part of the social system created by these corporations, these people that own these trusts, such as Rockefeller and Gates. And they bring us into them. They create these big corporations, and then if you want a job, you have to work for one of these corporations unless you strike out and do your own thing. But then if you work for one of these corporations, these fictions, you have to agree to Title 26, the IRS code. And these IRS codes are just part of a social system. They're not required. They're not constitutional. Nobody has to agree to it. But if you work for one of these corporations, you're going to have to agree to sign their papers, unless you do put yourself down as a private contractor. in which case the IRS often does come after people. So he's comparing in this article Daniel De Leon, slavery and trustocracy. So I'm going to read it real quick. It's only, 2 pages, one page front and back. And it's really quick, and it talks about the difference between slavery and trust. So he says the advocacy by the leading figure in the Socialist Party, Victor L. Berger, of the policy of buying the trusts, together with the argument that the gentleman supports the policy with Henry Clay's position to buy the slaves. Remember back in the old days, Henry Clay proposed this idea that in order to free the slaves, they buy the slaves, because then the slaves who are property are transferred to a different person, and then that person can free them. So they transfer them from slavery into a trust. And let's see. Okay, so let's go on. So Henry Clay's proposition to buy the slaves furnishes in hand a prime illustration of the blunders that attend upon ignorance of history, or rather shallowness of historic knowledge. Chattel slavery was recognized by the Constitution and was regulated in state laws. Okay, so laws here, I want to point out, is lowercase. So these are legal laws. These are not lawful laws. When law is capitalized, and I read a lot of old books, and the old books have better grammar, more accurate grammar. Laws man-made is always lowercase. Laws natural are always uppercase. Okay, law or laws uppercase is natural law, which is common law, because common law is natural law. It's supposed to be. Okay, so regulated by state lowercase laws. Whatever the horrors that accompanied the institution, there was no act, surely no conspicuous act of illegality. So the illegality of it was sort of hidden. Let alone violation of the criminal code that the slaveholder resorted to in order to increase his slave fold. So there were no conspicuous acts of illegality, which later in Trustocracy, he says the illegality of it, the unlawfulness of it was basically outright. So he says in Virginia, upon a systematic plan, in other southern states less systematically, the slaveholder multiplied his human chattel. On the plantations, he exploited the capital N Negro. I believe he's using Negro as specifying a race, okay, as he did his oxen. So abolitionists were hounded, ridden on rails, tarred and feathered, not infrequently even murdered. But this happened in the protection of the slaveholder's goods. The slaveholder acted on the defensive. His, in no conspicuous instance, was a policy of aggression to swell his human chattel havings and thereby add to his civic and economic political power, because remember, slaves had a portion of a vote. So the more slaves you had, the more votes you had. Deeply immoral as the slaveholder's corner principles were, not only did his conduct have its foundation in law, capital L, but was regulated as a rule by the canons of the capital L law, the canons of the natural law. The spirit of the slavocracy was adherence to a system of ethics that advancing materials surroundings rejected as base. So I believe the reason why they're using uppercase law and referring natural law is because slaves were considered property, and every man has a right to his property in the natural law. So when they say capital L natural, they're talking about natural law or common law. And under natural law, man has property, and slaves were considered property. Now, this has been thousands of years. We're not just talking about in America, the black people from the, 15, 16, 1700s where we had slaves, but he's talking about throughout time, the natural law allowed for property and slaves were considered property. So now he's going on to the trustocracy. Otherwise, materially otherwise, with the trustocracy. Like the slavocracy formerly, trustocracy now is rooted in the capital L law, but differently from the slavocracy, trustocracy increases its powers by violations of the natural law. Like the slavocracy formerly, trustocracy now takes full advantage of the opportunities offered to it and justifies its existence by the natural law. It doesn't say natural law, it just says capital L law. But differently from the slavocracy, trustocracy is a criminal by the standard of its own society. So even the people who created the trusts knew that what they were doing was criminal. Okay? Slavocracy and trustocracy are animals of different order. As such, they render different treatment imperative. Slavery under the slavocracy, society under the slavocracy may be said to have been directly responsible for the legitimate, because inevitable, evils of the institution. The thought of buying off the institution, however limping a thought, in that it ignored sociologic forces against which the thought was bound to dash itself, and its ethical foundation. Well may participants in an evil foot the bill for its removal. Otherwise, with the trustocracy, by no process of sane reasoning can society be held responsible for crimes of the trustocracy, for its fraudulent weights, its fraudulent issues of stock, its falsification of its own books, its perjuries, its bribery of government, its confiscation of property. In short, all the acts by means of which it took a short cut across lots in the evolutionary field and enthroned itself the ruffian usurper that it is. No such plea is allowed in behalf of the individuals from the trustocracy who are caught today. If the individual criminal is dealt with accordingly, should the band of criminals, when corralled, be treated any better? So, are you treating individuals differently than the group? When Henry Clay proposed to buy the slaves, he, at least, was ethically sound. When the Socialist Party now proposes to buy the trusts, the material foundation being wanting to its ethics, it stands with its feet up in the air to sign manual of its whole existence. Okay, so now let's put slavocracy to the side for a minute and talk about the trustocracy. Now, we know that our government has been usurped by elite or status quo, the wealthy. I've got to pause this for a minute. Now, I mentioned a little bit more about the trusts and how this document's talking about trust and socialism. So we're going to talk about trusts and socialism, and where do we find these socialistic laws in government. And how do we tell the difference? Okay, so trusts do not have a positive law citation. The constitutional laws have a positive law citation. That's how we know they're constitutional, because they have passed the constitutional requirements that are shown in the Constitution, that a law passed that conforms to the Constitution has to have a positive law citation, has to pass all these tests, and it's given a positive law citation, meaning it's constitutional. Once something's determined constitutional and given a positive law citation, it can be cited. That positive law citation can be cited, or that title can be cited as positive law, because the citation is very specific and it's in the front part of the title usually. Sometimes they're in the back part of the title. So why do they do that? Because sometimes the first part of the title is not constitutional, but something later is, and then everything after that is cited as constitutional and has a positive law citation after that. So when the courts are looking at laws, they have to find, the federal courts, they have to find the positive law citation. If they don't find it, they don't apply the Constitution. They apply the socialist title, the trustocracy title, the title that doesn't have a positive law citation. There are many titles that are socialist in nature and have no positive law citation and requires you signing something or following it in order to have them act against you if they determine that you've done something wrong. So when you go to a court and the court does not find the positive law citation, that's evidence to the court that this is a social contract, because social things are by contract, right? So if there is a positive law citation, this is a constitutional thing. No contract is required. The Constitution is the contract. And certain people are expected to follow the Constitution, mostly military. So prima facie evidence, if the title is given a positive law citation, that positive law citation is the prima facie, on its face, immediately visible, that the court is following the Constitution. Okay, so if the court is bound to the Constitution, they know it because it has a positive law citation and that title has gone through all the tests required to be considered constitutional. So if a law is not constitutional, it's not given a positive law citation, and something has to be done. Some sort of contract has to be signed. Some sort of act has to be done. So if the court cannot find the positive law citation, then they must at least find that you acted in some sort of way, because that is a certain type of contract, or they have to find the actual contract in which you signed, which would probably be presented by the people bringing you to court. So let's use the IRS, for example. The IRS, the Internal Revenue Code, Title 26, does not have a positive law citation, is not cited as if it were a positive law. It's not a constitutional law. And people get confused by this because they say, well, the federal government's allowed to tax. Yeah, forget about that for a minute, because that's a whole different animal. We're talking about the Internal Revenue Code, Title 26, without a positive law citation, is a social contract in which you have to sign in order for them to take your money and then bring you to court if you decide not to pay or you don't pay enough or whatever. Okay, so you have positive law, constitutional, no positive law, social, trustocracy, trust. Okay, there's a lot of these titles that don't have a positive law, that are part of a social contract that requires you to do something, to go out there and do something. And when you go out there and do something on your own, you're volunteering. So you're volunteering to become a part of a socialist system which has no constitutional standing in a republic, in our republics. So they do it because you do it. So they administer it. They administer the trust because you volunteer and you say, well, I want this. And it's a free country. It's a free country. So if you want to volunteer to be part of a social system within a republic or within a federal state, then okay, they'll do it. So it's interesting to note here that the first title that has no positive law citation is Title II Congress. So what does that tell us? Title II Congress. This is the social Congress. This is not the true federal constitutional Congress. This is a social Congress. Okay, this is the Congress without a positive law citation that is administering the trust. These are not, these are elected people elected to control and administer the trust, but it's outside the Constitution. It's not constitutional. Okay, so Title II Congress is a social system because it has no positive law citation. Title VI, domestic security. Okay, there's nothing in the Constitution and there's no proper perception of the Constitution that allows for Title VI, domestic security. It does not pass the constitutional test. If it was constitutional, it would pass the constitutional test, and believe me, they would give it a positive law citation because then they could use it against you constitutionally and they wouldn't have to get you to sign anything. Title VII, agriculture. Title VIII, aliens and nationality. Title 12, banks and banking. There's nothing about banks and banking in the Constitution because this is not given a positive law citation, and so it's part of a social system that you agree to. You go and you get a loan. You go and you get a mortgage. Okay, and they administer all that. Title 15, commerce and trade. A lot of the legal system is controlled by these trusts, and it controls our transportation, our driver's license, our trade with other countries outside of the Constitution. Okay, they're doing this unconstitutionally. They're doing it as part of a social system that you agree to. Title 16, conservation. And the less we know, the further they're gonna take things, the further they're gonna go, right? Because we don't have the knowledge to fight. We don't have the knowledge to know what's going on, so we just go along with it and say, well, I have to, I'm supposed to. It's one of the titles, but this is a social title without a positive law citation, administered by a social Congress, a Congress under a trust. Okay, so we have Title 16, conservation, Title 19, customs and duties, Title 20, education. The education is run by a trust. They don't want you smart. They don't want you knowledgeable, because then you would figure out that they have no legitimate and authentic power unless or until you sign a paper or you send your kids to school. Okay, Title 21, food and drugs. Title 22, foreign relations and intercourse. These things might be in the Constitution, but the way they're doing it is not constitutional. So they can't give it a constitutional citation. They can't give it a positive law citation. Title 23, highways, has an asterisk by it, which means it's saying that it's constitutional. But when you look at Title 23, highways, there's no positive law citation to be found. It might be in one public law somewhere within, kind of hidden, but the entire title doesn't have a positive law. And I've written these people who have this website, which is supposed to be an actual government website, and asked them about it, and they give me the runaround, of course. Title 24, hospitals and asylums. Where does the federal government have the right to administer any hospitals and asylums? Now, people might say, well, what about the Veterans Administration and disabled veterans? That's a trust. The Veterans Disability Administration, all that is a trust. You're not entitled to it, but they allow it because it's part of a trust, and it's worked into the agreement when you go into the military, right? If you become disabled. If it were constitutional and you had, you would have to apply, right? You would be given it. So hospitals and asylums, Title 25 Indians, Title 26 Internal Revenue has no positive law citation. You have to sign all their documents. You have to jump through all these hoops. You have to do all these things because it's a social contract. It's part of a trust. Title 27 Intoxicating Liquors. Now, the federal government can control intoxicating liquors on federal lands. But when you apply for a license off federal lands, you're saying that you're going to agree to this Title 27 social system. Okay, Title 29, labor. Title 30, mineral lands and mining. This is just a way for them to socialize the minerals and the resources of the country to get control of them so that the trust can gain more money from it. Okay, these mineral lands and minings are supposed to belong to the people. Okay, Title 32, National Guard. No, not that one. That has an asterisk. Title 33, Navigation in Navigable Waters, getting a license to drive a boat. Title 34, Crime Control and Law Enforcement. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows for crime control and law enforcement. That's supposed to be done by the military. The military has two purposes. Well, one purpose, defense, and they do it for two different types of people, foreign and domestic. And when they do it foreign, it's being invaded by a foreign power. And when they do it domestic, it's being invaded by their own people to overthrow a republic. The governor is supposed to call the military, and the government's supposed to call, the state governor is supposed to call the president, and the president is supposed to send in the military to help keep the republic in power. But the governors now, they work for these trustocracies, right? Where am I? Crime control and law enforcement, Title 42, the public health and welfare. That's part of a trust. Nobody has to abide by it. You don't have to go to the Food and Drug Administration to get your products approved. But if you have some kind of license, like if you're a doctor, if you have a medical clinic or all these other things, then you're agreeing to it. You're agreeing to follow these social rules, because if I went to school and I became a doctor, I would have to have a license to practice in the social system, which is really the only way to make money, unless you strike out on your own, and you're not going to make usually as much money. Some people do, I guess. But if you want to be part of that system, when you get your license, they say that you're going to abide by all these other social laws, these other titles. And so that's how they get you. If you're a doctor and you come up with something and you make a product that helps people get well, and you didn't get it approved by the FDA, they go after your license. Okay, so then we have the public health and welfare, Title 43 public lands, Title 45 railroads, Title 47 communications. Let's see, the last one, Title 50, war and national defense. Okay, so that's not in the Constitution. What's in the Constitution is the military, and that's under Title 10, armed forces. Okay, so even nowadays, when you join the military, you have to sign a contract. That's always been the case, because you're joining a system. You're joining a social system that's allowed by the Constitution. You sign a contract, you sign it for dedicating your life for a number of years, and they can hold that against you. That's the contract that the Constitution allows, okay? All these other things that are social contracts that don't have a positive law citation require you to do something or sign something. And so that's what this article's talking about, that trustocracy is like slavery, in that it gets you to volunteer yourself. Now, in the Constitution, we know that you can't be brought into something non-voluntarily. Everything has to be by volunteer. You have to volunteer to do it. It's I forget what it's called. It's one of the in the Bill of Rights. It's an amendment. Okay, so trustocracy are the non-positive laws, which we have to do something or sign something. So if you go to the airport and you want to take a flight, you have just volunteered to be part of the trust, to have all these trust laws applied against you. You get a driver's license, you have trust laws applied against you. You sign your papers to volunteer to pay taxes, you have these trust laws applied against you. You apply for any license, a Mariner license, a TWIC card, a CDL, all these things. And when you apply for them and you get them, you look at the contract and you see that it's now pointing to other social laws. Now, it can also say you have to abide by these other non-social laws that are constitutional laws, because we can use the Constitution as part of our social system. We can say, well, you know, if you get a driver's license, you can be drafted. Or if you get a driver's license, they could say you have to abide by this, and this constitutional law. They're not, you know, the Constitution can't require things that are not in it. But if you volunteer to follow things constitutional that are in the social contract, they can do that too. Okay. Even though if you didn't volunteer for those social things, the Constitution wouldn't apply to you unless you're on a federal military post or you're on federal lands. Okay, so that's what I wanted to go over in this video. And I hope this made sense, and that you start thinking about what I'm saying. You start talking to people about this kind of stuff. And if you don't completely understand it, just go out there and try to find people who do understand this, because a lot of people are starting to understand this. Watch some of my other videos. I also have a book called Perceptions of Freedom, and I talk about in this book how the Constitution is very limited. It's not what people think it is. It doesn't apply to people off federal lands for the most part, unless, you know, for some reason there's some sort of discrepancy against federal lands and state lands, and federal lands that were taken from private citizens, given to the federal government. And then there's an argument between a private citizen and the federal government on what part of those lands were transferred to the federal government and what part weren't, and whether those private citizens actually transferred that land to the federal government or allowed it. And some private citizens had become federal citizens because the land was in their family for a long time, and they kept the land, but the land was moved to become private instead of state. So there's a lot of misunderstanding between the private citizens on federal government lands and whether those private citizens were no longer state citizens and become federal citizens, and whether they had a right to vote, whether they didn't have a right to vote, whether they came under federal law, state law, paid federal taxes, state taxes, because there was a separation. State people didn't pay federal taxes. So once these private people became part of the federal military post in that state, there was a question. There were a lot of arguments in Congress about whether or not these people paid state taxes and federal taxes, just federal taxes, just state taxes. And this is confusing to a lot of people because they see private citizen, individual, entity, born alive, and they think that applies to every single human being in America. But just think, the United States of America is not the United States. They're two different entities. They have two different functions. One is the military and one is the free, sovereign, and independent states. The United States of America is free, sovereign, and independent states. Okay, so check out my book. You can email me at theveteranlibertylion if you want to know, at gmail.com, if you want to know more about the book and how to get it. It's $20. It's 68 pages. It's a wealth of information. I tried to be very straightforward. I tried to lay it out in line with the timeline of the organic documents and explain things to people in the most simplest way I could, so that you can understand what the Constitution is, who it applies to, what are the jurisdictions, and where the lands are. Okay, and how you are free, and that you're not required to sign or participate in this non-constitutional social system. Okay, so with that, I bid you farewell. Have a great day. Have a great week. I'll say what Gregory Mannarino says: love each other, care about each other, and I'll see you in the next video.